Welcome, everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started. I'm Luna Goldberg, the Education Manager at the Jewish Museum of Florida, FIU, and the Wolfsonian FIU. And on behalf of the Jewish Museum, the Wolfsonian Public Humanities Lab, and our sponsors, the Humanities Edge and the Holocaust and Genocide Studies program at FIU, it's my pleasure to welcome you to Towards More Inclusive Children's Literature, Combating Antisemitism. Tonight's event features three distinguished panelists, Dr. Ruth Behar, Dr. Rachel Conrad, and Dr. David M. Perry, all of whom I'll introduce more fully momentarily. I'd like to start off tonight's program by speaking briefly to current events and how this panel came together. About 6 months ago, I received an email from Dr. Julio Capo, my colleague from the WPHL and co-organizer on this program, about an article that Dr. Perry had written titled, "Why I Hope My Kids Never Read Roald Dahl." The article, which Dr. Perry will elaborate on this evening, came as a shock to both of us, having grown up reading Dahl's classic books without picking up on the anti-Semitic content. As some of you know, the mission of the Jewish Museum of Florida is to advance the understanding and appreciation of Jewish culture and to preserve and share the history and stories of Jewish life in Florida. And these last few months in particular have been trying for our community. Just last month, I received a call from a community member whose neighborhood had recently been targeted overnight as anti-Semitic flyers were left at hundreds of homes. Once the police had collected the evidence they needed for their investigation, people living in the neighborhood were told that they could destroy these graphics, and he wanted to make sure that the museum had a copy for the future generations interested in studying what's happening currently. And lastly, on International Holocaust Remembrance Day this past January, a school district in Tennessee announced that it was banning Art Spiegelman's graphic novel about the Holocaust, Mouse, over concerns for its language. All of these events, while not explicitly connected, affirm the need for tonight's program, and we're so honored that you are here to share it with us. I'll now introduce our panelists in the order of their presentations. David M. Perry is a freelance journalist and historian. He's the co-author of The Bright Ages, A New History of Medieval Europe. He spent 10 years as a history professor at Dominican University in Chicago, but returned to the Twin Cities recently in 2017 to become the senior academic advisor in the history department at the University of Minnesota. His journalism has appeared recently on CNN, In the Nation, Smithsonian Magazine, The Washington Post, and the New York Times, among others. Rachel Conrad is professor of childhood studies at Hampshire College. She's the author of Time for Childhoods, Young Poets and Questions of Agency, and co-editor of Literary Cultures and the 20th Century Childhoods. And our last panelist, Dr. Ruth Behar, is a cultural anthropologist, poet, and writer of fiction for young people. She has written numerous books, and her latest work is a debut picture book, Tia Fortuna's New Home, a Cuban Sephardic story about intergenerational memory, which we'll be giving out some copies of this evening. Baehaar is the recipient of a MacArthur Genius Grant and a Guggenheim Fellowship, and was named a Great Immigrant by the Carnegie Corporation. She is a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and is the James W. Fernandez Distinguished University Professor of Anthropology at the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor. Throughout tonight's program, members of the audience are encouraged to submit questions to the Q&A box that I will later pose to the panelists following their presentations. Now, without further ado, please welcome our first speaker, Dr. David M. Perry.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me. And it's really quite something to be in this panel, because I wrote this essay because I almost didn't write it. I remember seeing the news come around about Netflix acquiring all the rights to Roald Dahl and that lots of new programming was coming. and I was complaining in my home and complaining on social media. And I just thought, everyone has already reckoned with the fact that Roald Dahl was an anti-Semite. And if this is news to you, I'm guessing it's mostly not if you're here, but if it's news to you, I'll talk about that in a minute. But I really felt, yeah, everyone knows this. Everyone has reckoned with it. What's the point of writing an essay? But I did, and obviously it's had some impact. And even if the impact is just this group, that's sufficient for the work. But it is not sort of universally known. And I'm really humbled that this essay that I almost didn't write, and that I wrote in a kind of a surly, no one's going to read this mode, has in fact reached some people. So as Luna mentioned, I'm a medieval historian by training, and I'll talk a little bit more about modern kids lit. But I want to start with a piece of medieval history, as is sort of my training and my identity, right? So in 1172, a Christian monk named Thomas of Monmouth completed a book about the death and alleged miracles of St. William of Norwich. Thomas had been hard at work for decades, writing and rewriting his book, trying to establish a local cult of sainthood around William, a boy who did live and who seems to have been murdered in 1144. And in this final version of this book that Thomas was writing, he decided to allege that William had been lured to death by the Jews of the city of Norwich, a city in England, who had ritually sacrificed the child on Easter in a perversion of the crucifixion. And to spice up the story, because again, remember, Thomas is trying to promote this thing he wants to promote, this local religious practice. To spice up the story, Thomas tapped into already existing myths about an international Jewish conspiracy. Again, we're in the 12th century. Here we are in the 12th century, 800 years ago. He's tapped into these myths. He described a secret meeting whereby Jews would gather in Narbonne, a city in southern France, the rumored seat of the king or pope of the Jews, again, according to medieval myth. Thomas wrote that the secret Jewish group cast lots to see where they would sacrifice a Christian child this year. And when the lottery fell to Norwich, the Jews murdered this boy. So let me be really clear. None of that is true, except for the fact that this guy named Thomas wrote the book. None of that stuff he's writing about is true. There was a boy named William. He does seem to have been murdered. The culprit remains unknown, according to people who studied it. There was no international Jewish conspiracy to murder Christian children in the Middle Ages or any other time. But here's why I'm opening with this, because I guess it must have been 2007, I was teaching for the first time, just out of grad school. I was teaching at a small teaching college in the Chicago area, and I had them read some of the text from this Thomas of Monmouth book so we could talk about anti-Semitism in the Middle Ages. And as I always do at the beginning of class, I said, so what'd you think? And one student said, I had no idea this was true about this conspiracy and these murders. So that was a lesson for me, that you can't just let conspiracy theories lie. You can't just, that they are dangerous, that they are pernicious, that they wriggle inside our consciousness, that you can't just present these materials without context, without doing the work. And I've tried to carry that with me when writing about anti-Semitism, which sadly I'm doing more and more, in part when thinking about these stories and when thinking about things like Roald Dahl, which is another way of presenting, particularly in The Witches, which I'll talk about a little more in a moment, certain kinds of anti-Semitic narratives. So in my Roald Dahl essay, and I'll put a link up in a minute if people would like to read it, but I'm going to talk about it for a little bit. I start by identifying myself as a nerdy Jewish kid, growing up Jewish in Indiana and Tennessee. I think I should say in this group, I have never been a practicing Jew in terms of my own religious practice. I was raised Unitarian Universalist. My Jewish heritage is tied up in New York communist Judaism, who kept Judaism but rejected religion, I guess would be the way to talk about my grandparents. So I always knew I was Jewish. I always thought of myself as Jewish, but it was never in terms of a regular religious practice. And I think that's important kind of to say. And during those years, I read Roald Dahl. and he was important to me. He was one of the early important authors, not the only one, but he has these kids that are kind of weird outsiders. They're kids that connect better with adults than with other children. If you think about my two favorite books as a kid, were the Charlie book, the first one, though I read the second one too, maybe there are more, and James and the Giant Peach, but both Charlie and the Chocolate Factory and James and the Giant Peach have this weird kid who connects with adults and not other children. And I sure felt like that. So it was really important to me as a book. And then in my 30s, I find out that during this time I was reading it so I was reading this in the 1980s. During those years in particular, Roald Dahl was saying lots and lots of anti-Semitic things, and in fact, embedding them into his literature. So the reason I bring this up is that whenever we talk about people from a previous generation, sorry, I'm not quite sure. Whenever we talk about artists from previous generation, there's a tendency to say, well, they were people of their time, or, I mean, there are lots of 19th century writers who I like who in fact were anti-Semitic, but they didn't necessarily operate in my timeline. We can certainly talk about them, we should talk about it, but there's a tendency to kind of push them into the past, and that's a complicated subject. Roald Dahl was doing this in the 80s when I was a kid. And now I am not a kid, I'm the father of two. And I really haven't had any Roald Dahl in my family's life, though they've encountered them. It's just not a story that I want to tell. So here's a couple of things just so you know about him. And I'll just offer a couple more examples, and then I'll pass it over to my distinguished panelists. So co-panelists. Here's a couple examples. In 1983, he suggested that, first of all, that Jews, we had allowed ourselves to be massacred by the Nazis, which is a very standard sort of anti-Semitic myth, that the Holocaust was our fault for not resisting. And then he said, this is a quote, there is a trait in the Jewish character that does provoke animosity. There's always a reason why anti-anything crops up, and even a stinker like Hitler didn't just pick on them for no reason. He wrote about American Jewish bankers dominating the US government. And then in 1990, again, not so long ago, I was in college at the time, he said, I am certainly anti-Israel and I have become anti-Semitic. So I think it's fair to call someone an anti-Semite who says, I am anti-Semitic. Second of all, his family's apologized for it, but it's not just like he had these views and then wrote innocuous children's literature. Most famously is the Witches. And in the Witches, Dahl creates kind of a cast of these hook-nosed women. They print money and they kidnap and murder innocent children. It is very clearly linked to this long history of the blood libel, the story of the ritual, the kidnapping and ritual murder of children by Jews that I started with the William of Norwich story. And it's right there in the Witches. Now, there are other things going on in the Witches. I also think it's misogynist. And if you start reading Roald Dahl and looking at women, you will see it is filled with misogyny. Most of my journalism, at least initially, was really about disability issues. I can tell you that the disability values, the ableism embedded in Roald Dahl is also terrible. Go read about those kids. Go read about Augustus Gloop in Charlie and the Chocolate Factory with thinking about ableism, thinking about fat phobia, and you will encounter something that, at least for me, these are not values I want to share with my children. So I wrote this piece saying, knowing that I would be accused of trying to cancel Roald Dahl, and I guess I am, in the sense that his books aren't welcome in my house. But if a kid brought one home, I would want to engage these things head on. And that's really my lesson. And my lesson from that first anecdote in the teaching, and my lesson as a father, is that there's lots of material that children bring home or they encounter in school that are that can have problematic elements or even really deeply troubling issues like the Witches and his blood libel story. I don't have the power to cancel Roald Dahl. Netflix just paid an awful lot of money to make more products based on his material. So instead, I'm hoping that we can be aware of the problems embedded in them. If they're trying to write the anti-Semitism out of movies of the Witches, which they've kind of tried to do, then they have to we have to go right at that. I see we have an anti-Semite, in fact, in our chat right now. So hopefully for the rest of you, that just makes the stakes very clear of what's going on here. It has been, one more thing. It's been a funny time. Sorry, I was a little thrown off by that comment. It's been a funny time to be someone who is Jewish like me, which is to say always Jewish, but not always thinking about being Jewish. There's a kind of privilege in that, or maybe a kind of self-erasure. It's a complicated, this is not about my identity, but it's a complicated story of when I think about it. But certainly in the last 5 years, I've never felt more Jewish. That it was right after the election of 2016 that I was first called the K word. My whole life I've been Jewish, but that was the first time called the K word. I've become increasingly aware of the anti-Semitism I encountered as a kid. Just being told in Tennessee that because I was Jewish, I'd be going to hell. That's actually not a great thing to tell a 15-year-old, but it happened all the time. Or having pennies thrown at me or my classmates and trying to laugh it off. This is the moment in which I hope people like me and people like this community are called to really push back, and that I can't personally just let things slide. And so that's why I wrote. I hope my children don't read Roald Dahl, and I really do hope they don't. Thanks so much.
Thank you, David. I now want to turn it over to Rachel Conrad.
Thank you, Luna. I want to thank all the organizers of this event. I'm really honored to be among the panelists tonight. And actually, I'm going to be showing some slides. So I want to just start by sharing my screen. Okay. So I'd like to start out by mentioning what prompts me to talk about Anne Frank as part of this panel. I teach at Hampshire College, a small liberal arts college in Massachusetts, and I continue to meet college students, 18, 19-year-old students, who may have heard of Anne Frank as a child victim of the Nazis who lived in hiding with her family in the Netherlands, or they may have been exposed to the Broadway play or the graphic adaptation based on Anne Frank's diary, but very few have ever read Anne Frank's actual writing. So one question that motivates me is, why are we reluctant to see children as writers, as the authors of their own perspectives, as experts on their experiences, and as perceptive readers of the world around them? We do have access to a number of diary accounts of children's wartime experiences. A late 20th century wartime diary that's still readily available is Zlata's Diary by Zlata Felipe, a young girl writing about her experiences during the Bosnian War in the 1990s, who in fact was influenced by Anne Frank. But public audiences are much less likely to have access to writing by children about their everyday experiences of anti-Semitism or other forms of injustice, bias, and oppression. Having access to wonderful books by adults like Ruth Behar that center experiences of characters of diverse identities and contextualize experiences of oppression is tremendously valuable for young audiences. And so is providing children with opportunities to engage in their own writing and learn about writing by other young people. So how did Anne Frank write about anti-Semitism? How important is it that we as an audience, as readers of her diary or viewers of cultural productions about her, have access to her own words? Anne Frank was 13 and 14 years old at the time of writing her diary. And here are some passages from the diary where she writes about anti-Semitism. November 19th, 1942. In the evenings when it's dark, I often see long lines of good, innocent people accompanied by crying children walking on and on, ordered about by a handful of men who bully and beat them until they nearly drop, and all because they're Jews. And almost a year and a half later, after a burglary that resulted in police coming very close to their hiding place, Anne Frank wrote, "We've been strongly reminded of the fact that we're Jews in chains, chained to one spot without any rights, but with 1,000 obligations. Through the ages, Jews have had to suffer, but through the ages, they've gone on living, and the centuries of suffering have only made them stronger. And while the earlier entry referred to her own observations of Jews in Amsterdam, seen from her window being rounded up, in the later entry, she brings in issues of rights and contextualizes her experience in terms of the history of Jewish suffering under oppressive conditions. A little over a month after that last entry, she wrote in response to changing attitudes and a rise of anti-Semitism among Dutch Christians. Oh, I'm sorry. To our great sorrow and dismay, we've heard that many people have changed their attitude toward us Jews. We've been told that anti-Semitism has cropped up in circles where once it would have been unthinkable. And that last passage was written a couple of months before Anne Frank and the other residents of the Secret Annex were discovered and deported to concentration camps. Yet the popular resonance of her work evades her awareness of anti-Semitism and focuses instead on a universalizing message of hope. Many of the adult-created cultural productions based on Anne Frank's diary, plays and films, lean on the spirit of one sentence that appears late in the diary and is often taken out of context. I still believe, in spite of everything, that people are truly good at heart. Yet in the same diary entry, she talks about the current moment as one when the worst side of human nature predominates. Popularized accounts of Anne Frank often erase or obscure the despairing and pessimistic aspects of her writing and the complexities of her emotions and perspective, the multiple strands of hope, despair, clear-sightedness, and anxiety that are intertwined in her writing. In fact, the publication of Anne Frank's diary is a kind of sleight of hand. Would Anne Frank have chosen the English title Diary of a Young Girl for her work? We know she didn't. She explicitly mentioned a different title in her diary which she wanted for publication. It translates in English to The House Behind or The Secret Annex. This was the title of the book published in Dutch in 1947, shown here on the left, alongside the first English version published in 1952. You may know that while Anne Frank began her diary as a private space of confiding aspects of her life to Kitty, the persona she assigned to the diary as her companion, in the last 4 months of her writing in hiding, her goals changed. In late March 1944, a Dutch government minister spoke on the radio about the value of first-person accounts of the German occupation of the Netherlands. And after this, Anne Frank had her eye on publication. She wrote, Mr. Bolkestein, the cabinet minister, speaking on the Dutch broadcast from London, said that after the war, a collection would be made of diaries and letters dealing with the war. Of course, everyone pounced on my diary. Just imagine how interesting it would be if I were to publish a novel about the Secret Annex. The title alone would make people think it was a detective story. After that day, Anne Frank went back to the beginning of the diary she'd been keeping for almost 2 years and began revising it into a memoir. Broadly speaking, diaries and memoirs differ in these basic ways. Diaries record events and experiences in an immediate time-based structure, and memoirs are crafted selectively through reflection, distillation, and integration. Anne Frank saw herself Anne Frank saw herself as an aspiring writer. And a few months after she started to rewrite her diary with an eye toward publication, she wrote, "You've known for a long time that my greatest wish is to be a journalist and later on a famous writer. In any case, after the war, I'd like to publish a book called The Secret Annex. It remains to be seen whether I'll succeed, but my diary can serve as the basis." So there are multiple versions of Anne Frank's book. There's her original diary and the version that she herself edited into a memoir, as well as multiple versions translated and edited by adults, including her father, Otto Frank. The first published version of the diary was a selective combination of the original diary and the version that Anne had edited and rewritten, though it was weighted more towards the diary account. When the definitive edition, as it's called, appeared in the early 1990s, it offered a more balanced combination of diary and memoir. And that's the version generally read today, though it still differs from the one Anne Frank was preparing for publication. The differences become even greater when we look at the adult-authored cultural adaptations of Anne Frank's diary, the 20th century plays and films that helped popularize her. These plays and films bend the story and the image of Anne Frank to concepts of childhood that reinforce innocence, victimhood, and naivete, rather than initiative, insight, and the authority of a writer and cultural creator. This is evident in the 1955 Broadway play and the 1959 film version, which led to the line, "I still believe, in spite of everything, that people are truly good at heart," emerging as the main message of Anne Frank's writing that still lingers today. Scholars and critics like Cynthia Ozick have made the argument that the cultural adaptations and popular perceptions of Anne Frank converted her from a young Jewish writer who wrote about the situation of European Jews in the context of her life in hiding and was persecuted and ultimately murdered because of her Jewishness, to a universal symbol of hope, an accessible window onto Holocaust history and part of a generalized view of oppression. To produce the image of Anne Frank as a universal symbol of hope necessitates downplaying or even erasing her skill as a writer. It requires seeing her only as a child diarist whose life was cut short, rather than as an astute and skillful writer who was in the process of editing and transforming her work for a public audience. In today's terms, we could see the co-option of Anne Frank's image also as a whitewashing, a minimizing of her Jewishness and representation of her Jewish identity that serves an additional purpose of making her whiter and less ethnic. So this image-making process delimits and alters Anne Frank across multiple dimensions. Rather than a capable, intentional writer envisioning a public audience, she's seen as a child writing a private diary. Rather than a Jewish person persecuted for her Jewishness, she's seen as a universalized or generalized symbol of victimhood. In terms of her status as a child, this image-making retains and upholds a notion of children as limited in their capacities and ambitions and at the mercy of adults, rather than as capable, intentional, and powerful in their perceptions and abilities. Anne Frank herself, in her writing, advocated for views of young people as full persons who are capable and aware. So the popularized image of Anne Frank actually subverts her own views of youth and their capacities. An alternative to the popularized view is to see Anne Frank as a young person keenly aware of the power of her writing, who was experimenting with multiple forms of writing about her experience, editing her diary into a memoir, transforming some diary entries into creative nonfiction, with an eventual public audience in mind. In this alternative, Anne Frank's identity as young and Jewish, in addition to her gender identity as female, are crucial to her life and death and to her work as a writer. More recently, there have been publications that have come closer to recognizing Anne Frank's own goals as a writer. There are now 2 scholarly volumes that present Anne Frank's works in more complete forms. However, the revised critical edition shown on the left has an interesting history that reflects the contradictions in the reception of Anne Frank as a writer. From the 1950s onward, there have been challenges to the authenticity of the published diary for many reasons, including Holocaust denial and disbelief that a young person could write in the sophisticated style and manner found particularly towards the end of the diary. In the 1980s, the Netherlands Institute for War Documentation was bequeathed the original diary manuscripts after the death of Otto Frank. And they undertook an exhaustive study of the handwriting and these original documents. And the study concluded that the diary was authentic and that the seemingly different handwritings found across this extended time period of the diary, and this is a quote from the study's conclusion, are by the same hand with a probability bordering on certainty. So it's ironic that we owe one of these scholarly volumes to the challenges made to Anne Frank's authorship. In 2019, as you can see in the image on the right, this volume of Anne Frank's collected works appeared. And it acknowledges Anne Frank as a writer with a body of work that also includes fantasy tales and prose sketches and letters. Yet wider public recognition is not at all caught up. I think it is past time for a reconsideration of Anne Frank as a skillful young writer, aware of her social, cultural, and political world, who grappled with her intertwined identities as young, Jewish, and female, and used them in her writing. While this would have value in itself for Anne Frank's legacy and reception, it would also have value for our view of what children's literature is and can be. Right now, children generally have access only to texts written by adults, yet children have the right to be exposed to text written by children themselves on their own terms. Children deserve an age-inclusive children's literature that recognizes outstanding works by children as literary works. And children deserve to be encouraged to write across many genres, including diary, memoir, fiction, poetry. I do see this as a question of rights. Children have the right to be taken seriously in their worlds, to not be belittled or looked down upon, and children have the right to be exposed to ideas and texts written by other people their age or by older youth who nonetheless share the social status of being young. I'll conclude by saying that children's perceptions and experiences of anti-Semitism and other forms of oppression are shaped also by their status as young people. Children's own writing can provide a window onto this. While it's imperative that we work toward a more inclusive literature for young readers, I argue that such inclusivity should also encompass the age of writers. And I look forward to our next panelist and the discussion together with all of you.
Thank you, Rachel. So our next speaker will be Dr. Ruth Behar. And before I hand it over, I first would like to remind everyone to please put your questions in the Q&A section. If you have any questions for our speaker, we'll return to them. And I also would like to remind the audience that this program is meant as a forum for questioning and for discussion, but that hateful speech and disrespectful questioning will not be tolerated in this space. So with that, I will hand it over to you, Ruth.
Thank you, Luna. Thank you so much. Thank you, Enrique and Julio. It's wonderful to be part of this panel. I've been learning so much from my two co-panelists, and I'm going to try to be brief, but if I'm not, Luna, do feel free to interrupt me if I'm going past time. I want to be sure there's time for the discussion. So let me quickly share my screen here. Now here, and that should work. Okay, so I was asked to speak about my new book, Tia Fortuna's New Home, which is a picture book in English and also in Spanish, El Nuevo Hogar de Tia Fortuna. And I'm a cultural anthropologist by training, but I've been starting to write books for children. I started 5 years ago, and I've been very interested for a long time. My research has focused on the Jewish Cuban community on the island, the Jewish community, Cuban community in the diaspora as well. Part of this is my own family history, and part of it is community studies that I've done as an anthropologist. And so I've been very, very interested in expanding our notion of what Jewishness means, bringing in the Latina identity as part of the Jewish multicultural notion of what this identity means, and also expanding ideas of what a Cuban or Latina might be, a Latinx person, and making it clear to people that there are Jewish people within that community as well. And so my own immigrant childhood in New York has been part of my work, studying that, and return journeys to Cuba have been a very important part of my work. And I have studied the Jewish community in Cuba in great depth. And now more recently, I've become interested in poetic and fictional visions of Jewish Cuba. So I'm going to race through this because I want to be sure we leave a lot of time for discussion. So my first book for kids is called Lucky Broken Girl, and it takes place in New York in the 60s. It's based on my own immigrant childhood as a Jewish Cuban girl growing up in New York in the 60s. And here's a picture of me as a child in Cuba standing before the Jewish Community Center in Havana. We lived very nearby. here I am with my parents. So I had this childhood that began in Cuba, and I was, brought up by a Jewish family in Cuba. I briefly went to a Jewish day school in Havana before my family decided to leave after the Cuban Revolution, and started a new life in New York. Here we are, just recently arriving in New York, my parents, my brother, and we settled in Queens in a very working class neighborhood. This is my grandfather with one of my cousins getting used to the snow in New York, coming from Cuba. And it took a while for us to settle in, but after a couple of years, the family was starting to adapt. And this lovely picture of this little birthday party, there I am with my mother. And we were living in a small 1-bedroom apartment, kind of, I was learning English. I went through the typical experience of not being able to speak English, when I arrived. There weren't any ESL classes at that time, and I really struggled to learn English. But by this moment in time, I'm already adapting. And so what happened in real life is I was adapting to life in the US as an immigrant, as a Jewish Cuban girl. And then we were in a terrible car accident in New York on the Belt Parkway. Here's an illustration that a friend of mine beautifully created for me. And I ended up injuring my leg. I was put in a body cast for close to a year. Here's an illustration that a child made after reading my book, Remember, Always Have Hope. And so I was in bed for a year, unable to walk, my immigrant family needing to take care of me. And the book definitely brings up Jewish Cuban identity, but it's not the main theme of the book, but definitely you learn about this girl and her Jewish Cuban background in that first book that I wrote. Now, more recently, in my novel Letters from Cuba, this one is inspired by my maternal grandmother's story. She was a Jewish Polish immigrant from Goworowo, a small town near Warsaw, and she goes to Cuba to meet up with her father, my great-grandfather, to help bring the rest of the family to Cuba on the eve of World War II. And this is the cover of Letters from Cuba. And this novel specifically deals with anti-Semitism, both in Europe. Esther, the main character, is escaping growing anti-Semitism in Poland that she discusses. The book is written as a series of diary entries or letter entries to her sister, who's waiting in Poland to be able to come to Cuba as well. And so that anti-Semitic climate is very clear in the book. And then she goes to live in Cuba, where most of the people are very tolerant of her and her father, but there is also anti-Semitism in Cuba. And I just want to point out that the reason that Jews go to Cuba in this period is because, in fact, the United States had a quota system that limited the number of people who could immigrate to the United States from Southern and Eastern Europe, and that mainly included a lot of Jewish people. And so they went to Cuba instead, which at this time was opening its doors to immigrants from Europe. So here's my maternal grandmother, Esther, on whom the story is based or inspired, the town of Goworowo that she was from in Poland. And she was able in real life to bring the family together in a small town in the province of Matanzas in Cuba, a small sugar growing town. That's my grandmother in the white dress in the front, and her siblings and parents, and my grandfather. But I was always aware that there were members of the family that didn't make it to Cuba. This was my grandmother's grandmother, who didn't want to leave Poland. She was afraid that Cuba was a kind of jungle that she didn't want to go to, and she was one of the many who perished in the Holocaust at that time. So I was always aware of that Cuba had offered my family refuge at a time when they would have very likely died in the Holocaust. And then I was so fascinated by the fact that my maternal family went to live in this small town in Agramonte. Here's some pictures of the town, historical pictures. So I went to the town as an anthropologist. I went there, I spent some time living there, got to know the people, got to know the history, and brought in a lot of that history into my novel, Letters from Cuba, particularly the history of sugar and slavery, which was a very important part of what happened in Matanzas, and that African heritage is very important in this part of Cuba, and that gets incorporated. The belief in San Lázaro, Babaluaye, in the Yoruba pantheon, that's a very important part of my story. And this is the world that Esther encounters in Cuba, the bata drums that are drummed on ritual occasions. And that is incorporated into the novel because I want young people to know about how Jewish people integrated themselves into Cuba and meshed with other cultures that exist there. The Chinese Cuban culture also exists in Cuba, and there were Chinese Cubans living in this town of Agramonte. And just to show you the Chinese presence in Cuba, this is a wonderful monument in Havana to remembering the Chinese people that fought for the independence of Cuba at the end of the 19th century. And here is this Jewish community center that I mentioned before. There are 3 synagogues still receiving communities in Havana. And so I wanted to bring all of those cultures together in my story and talk about Jewish identity, not in isolation, but in relationship to other cultures and other communities. And that's a very important part of Letters from Cuba. So now in my more recent book, so now I decided to write a picture book, and I had to struggle to figure out how to tell a story in about 800 words, 800, 900 words that would make sense. Every word would count. And it was an exciting and wonderful challenge. And this story takes place in Miami. Those of you in Miami know that there's a very important Jewish Cuban community in Miami. In Miami, I never have to explain my identity. In New York and Michigan, I often have to say, well, I'm Jewish, but I'm also Cuban, and have to explain this to people. But in Miami, you just start to tell people, I'm Cuban and I'm Jewish, and they'll go, yeah, you're a Juban. You know, there's a name for us. And so the story is set in Miami. I have a lot of family and friends in Miami. I've been spending a lot of time there since I was young. And I decided to tell this story. This story is based on my father's side of the family. So I'm Jewish from 2 directions. My mother's family is Eastern European background, Ashkenazi, as we say, and my father's family is Sephardic, originally from Spain 500 years ago. So they're part of the community that was expelled from Spain in 1492 because they chose to remain Jewish rather than convert to Catholicism, and they took that history with them forward as they moved to various parts of the world, particularly many of them to the countries of the Ottoman Empire. And so my family in particular left Spain and eventually found their way to Turkey, and then to Cuba, and then to the United States. And many people with this background live in Miami. And so that's where this story is based. And as I said, it's in English and Spanish, which I'm very, very pleased about. And so I wanted to address this Sephardic history and to try to do so in a very child-friendly way. So we have this character, Tia Fortuna, Aunt Fortune, who's basically sharing her traditions and the legacy of this history with her young niece named Estrella. Estrella means star. And she shares it by really just bringing Estrella very warmly into this culture without saying, even using the word Sephardic doesn't come up in the story, but that's the culture that's being shared. And it's this notion of Spaniards without a country. That's kind of a wonderful notion of what it means to be Sephardic. And the Sephardic Jews were always a community that was very, as Aaron Rodrigue and Sarah Abrevaya Stein say, it was a community where the boundaries were porous. It bled into, was constantly infused by other Jewish and non-Jewish cultures and vice versa. So I try to show that in the book. And so Silivri is the town in Turkey that my paternal grandparents were from. This is the Sephardic synagogue that existed in Havana that my family participated in. Here are my Sephardic grandparents with my aunt and uncle, and the little boy in white is my father, and then my aunt Fani, on whom this story is based and inspired. She was born later. And I have, here, and I wanted to show you this extraordinary picture of her in her wedding dress in Cuba, literally on the eve of leaving Cuba. She had this wedding in this gorgeous outfit. Anyway, and so there's this lively Sephardic community in Miami. As I said, there's Temple Moses, which is a Sephardic Cuban synagogue, and this incredible plaque that shows you how, as they left Cuba, they were remembering the departure from Spain as well 500 years ago, and this idea of being forced into exile, and that they will never forget what they left behind on the island of Cuba. And so all of that, the notion of memory is very, very important in this book. Tia Fortuna has all these memories that she shares with Estrella. And I also incorporated the gentrification that's happening in Miami Beach and in Surfside in particular. There's a reference to the Seaway, which is where Tia Fortuna lives. And this building it's a building with these very modest cottages, and the building is going to be demolished. And that was what I knew when I started writing the story. I didn't know exactly when or how it would be demolished. Now it has actually been demolished and it's gone, and they're building a luxury apartment building there. I went to see the Seaway several times. I had a friend who lived there, and I was just really taken in by these very modest and lovely cottages right on the beach. Here you can see what's happening now. And I just wanted in some way to honor that loss as well, what's happening to the landscape in Miami Beach. And so that became part of my story as well. So there's the Sephardic part, there's the Cuban part, and then there's the Miami part of the story. And this is what it's going to look like when it's done. It's going to be called the Seaway Villas. And there's a wonderful teacher who's been using the book in her ESL classes in Spanish, and getting young people to make illustrations based on the book. And I love this. You see the hotel that's going to be imposed on these pink casitas. I talk about Tia Fortuna's home as being a pink casita. And so I incorporated a lot of things from my own life, including embroidered pillows that end up in the story, hamsas, a lot of symbols of Sephardic culture end up there as well. Mazal, which means good luck. This is a Sephardic restaurant in Cordoba in Spain. So just design elements that I shared with the artist so that they would be part of the story. And then the key becomes a very important symbol. Those of you who know Sephardic Jews, the legend goes that they took the keys of their houses, of their houses with them when they left Spain in 1492. That's the legend. And so the key is also incorporated into the story. And I could talk more about that later. And so this is one of my favorite spreads, and you can see the embroidered pillow here, the hamsas and various symbols, lucky eyes as well. And this is where Estrella, the little girl, the niece, says, "Is that all you're taking with you?" As Tia Fortuna is packing up to leave her cottage at the Seaway, and she says, "I don't need much. I have so many memories in my suitcase right here." And she points to her head. So I will end there to be sure there's time for discussion. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Ruth, and thank you to our panelists. I'd like to ask everyone to come back on screen. We have a few questions in the chat, but I do want to turn things over first. Now that you've each heard from each other, I always have so many questions when I sit on a panel, so I wanted to open it up and ask if you have any questions for each other. And I also have questions for you. Okay, so I'll start us off. One of the things that I'm tasked with at the museum is to come up with curriculum and to teach a wide range of audiences about Jewish history. And so this is a very broad question, but how do you go about building these narratives that celebrate difference? And I think maybe it's most geared towards Ruth, but I think Rachel and David will both have some thoughts as well.
Well, I guess I'll start. Yeah, so I mean, I didn't expect to be doing what I'm doing. I didn't know I was going to be writing books for kids. This is just something that I just started doing it. And there's so many exciting things happening in children's literature now that Rachel was also speaking about, particularly this idea of we need diverse books, which is both, a movement and an organization. And I feel that now there's so much new literature being created that addresses diversity, that addresses different cultures, that addresses, all kinds of difference and acceptance and tolerance of difference. And that's where I see my work fitting in. I really see that a space has already been created by others, which is allowing me to do the work that I'm doing now. So I can't take credit for something like We Need Diverse Books. I'm so glad that other people already created that space. And so that now there's so many more possibilities for kids to find themselves in literature.
And I would just add to that, I agree that this organization we need and movement, We Need Diverse Books, is really wonderful. And this concept of own writers, own culture, that it's particularly important, really crucial to have writers who carry the identities that they're writing about, so a Jewish Cuban writer writing about Jewish Cuban experience. And that's, that recognition that's so crucial for children to be able to read, works alongside this valuing of diverse books for children.
Let me just add that, and this stuff is under attack, right? That we are in a particular political moment in which it's under attack. So I have, I'm a political writer among other things, as well as a historian, right? There is a nationwide movement, and it's not new. This was certainly something that has happened before throughout this history. And it's, in a lot of ways, it's working, right? Not only are laws being passed, but, you brought up the mouse story, and I have a story about encountering mouse and just like being blown, like, why did my parents have a comic book? And then being just totally, thinking I knew about the Holocaust, and then just having a whole different kind of experience, right? That book is not in those 8th grade classrooms, and you can still get it, but many of the kids, of course, won't. And it also won't be presented to them in a well-mediated, structured environment with a trained educator and really well-selected supporting materials, right? And so I guess, what I just want to say is that these wonderful things are under attack, and there's a lot of work to fight back against them, and to not celebrate. I don't know. I was really frustrated to see all of my huge parts of my friend group celebrating Maus on the New York Times bestseller list and out of print, which is great. But it doesn't solve the problem that there are 8th grade kids in Tennessee, of which I was an 8th grade kid in Tennessee, who are no longer being taught this book.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm going to turn to some of the questions in the chat, and I also want to remind our audience that they're welcome to keep adding. So we have a few questions from Dr. Oren Steer, who is the director of our Holocaust and Genocide Studies program at FIU. So thank you, Dr. Steer, for joining us. His first question is for Dr. Conrad. I appreciate how you yoke restoring agency to Anne Frank as a writer to her status as a talented child who wanted to be a published author, and to children's writing by children. I'd love to hear your reactions to Dara Horn's chapter on Frank in her recent book, People Love Dead Jews, since it's so relevant to the broader conversation about anti-Semitism. Have you read the chapter?
Yeah, and I'm very eager to read it. So that's my response at this time, and I'll have to circle back to that.
All right, we'll come back for Dr. Perry. So a larger question that relates to the persistence of conspirational discourse. I agree that calling it out is necessary, but when so many continue to believe in and spread conspiracies, anti-Semitism being one of the most popular and persistent ones, what other practical strategies are there for parents and educators?
I don't speak as an expert in parenting, I speak as a parent, right? So as a parent, my strategy has been to try to be really aware of what my children are consuming and to not shy away from having difficult conversations. And when there are conversations that are happening, and often my kids are more aware of it than I am. It's even inclusive children's literature, right? this is not a panel on Harry Potter and the author of Harry Potter, but my seventh grade kids are daughter is 100% aware of what's going on there and are having really nuanced and complicated conversations. And so what I needed was just to ask her and have her tell me her thinking. And I guess that's really in terms of conspiracy theories, right? But also not to just assume, and this was my lesson from Roald Dahl, not just assume that the thing that you think everybody knows is in fact something that everybody knows. And so to take the opportunities, whether in the home or in the classroom, or for me in this one moment on CNN, to really engage these things. But mostly for parenting, just stay on top of what your kids are consuming and talk to them.
And do you have any additions? I'll open it up because I think this one is one we can all speak to. Ruth or Rachel? On practical strategies for parents and educators?
Well, I guess I could say, I just don't want to say anything too obvious. I mean, I think, what was already said, by David made so much sense. Obviously, keeping the lines of communication open with your kids and talking to them. I just became a grandmother. So now, I'm wondering, what will I be saying to my 1-year-old granddaughter? So I think that's really, really important. But I think also to look to the people who are resources, librarians, in particular, I think children's librarians are very, very important resources as well. And they can lead kids. Sometimes maybe if a child doesn't want to listen to what their parent is recommending, maybe going to a librarian is another possibility. And I think there's such great resources for us, or can be in many communities, where, as David says, the possibility of reading certain texts is now being limited.
Yeah, and I would just add to all of the great things that David and Ruth were just saying, just listening to children's actual questions and to what they really want to know at that moment in time, and then trying to provide resources and information.
Yeah, and I guess from my end, I'll also add that, a lot of the programs and works that we do focus on visual and verbal literacy, because so often today we're inundated with information, and oftentimes it's on social media, but really teaching youth how to consume media and how to check sources and know which voices they want to amplify. I think that's a very important tool that we need to exercise more today. For Dr. Baehaar, I have another question from Oren. It's so interesting that you introduced your new children's book in the context of not having to explain your identity in Miami, as you need to elsewhere, even in New York, the so-called center of Ashkenazic Jewish culture. What has the response to your book been like? And I know you're coming off of, or maybe in the middle of, this big book tour.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think what happens is, in Miami, there are all these different kinds of Cuban communities, and they all coexist. Plus, there's a big Latinx community from many, many different parts of Latin America. And so there's kind of an understanding that all of these communities are there and converging in this place. And though New York has some of that as well, I think it's different. And I think the Ashkenazi background is so powerful in New York, having grown up in New York myself. So it's very powerful, and it's very much, like bagels and matzo ball, and, this is what it means to be Jewish, and, klezmer music. And I mean, that's part of my legacy as well. My maternal family, definitely is Ashkenazi. But the whole Sephardic part was always kind of exotic to many people in New York. And the fact that we spoke Spanish was exotic to many as well, in just your kind of classic, Eastern European Jewish community, that we seem to be Latinos. What were we doing going to a synagogue, and so just things that would seem to be very obvious. I think now there's much more awareness of the multiculturalism within the Jewish community. But in Miami, I feel like it's more of a given. And the book has been received well. I mean, we purposely chose to give it that tagline, a Jewish Cuban journey. So, when you pick up this picture book that you're going to be reading about Jewish people, but they're Jewish people who also happen to be Cuban. And then if you want to go even deeper, they're Jewish people who happen to be Sephardic. And so there are all these, layers of identity that are referenced here. Again, without making it, so heavy that it would be too much for a 5-year-old to take in this information. But the idea that it's all there, that there are layers of identity, and that you can be all of these different things, and maintain a sense of self that's complex, and yet a sense of self that others can relate to as well. And so people who've read the book, some people really relate to the Jewish part or the Cuban part or the Sephardic part, but some people also relate to the idea of home, which is a very important part of the story. And what is home? And here we have a character, Tia Fortuna, who has lost many homes, and now she's going on to a home, and the home that she's going to, the new home that she's going to, is an assisted living that she's going to go live in. And so that's her new home. And so there's kind of a sadness and an irony to it that the adult reader might pick up on, the child might not see it, but it's there. And it's one of the things that I wanted to mention also in response to what Rachel was saying, that I think that at least for me, in now writing for children, I feel often that I'm writing for the child inside myself, because I think we all have a child inside ourselves as well. And sometimes we don't have enough empathy for that child. And I feel like now that I'm writing these books, there's the child inside myself that I'm writing for, as well as young children now that I'm getting to know through this process of writing and sharing my work with them.
Thank you. We have a question for Julio Capo, who is the Deputy Director of the Wolfsonian Public Humanities Lab, our co-sponsor or co-organizer tonight. And Julio says, I'm going to skip over just to the question, that as he heard and saw all your wonderful presentations, I also realized that one of the things that can make children's literature so unique, of course, is the power of illustrations and visual art, not just the written word. I wonder if anyone has any thoughts on the power of visual in helping inclusive narratives tell that story.
I'm happy to yield to my panelists here. That's more it's what they do. So to talk about. Yeah.
Well, I think this is a great question for Ruth.
Yeah, me too. Me too. Yeah.
I mean, I'd love to hear a little bit, about how you think about the visual in relation to your text in your own books.
Well, I've always loved the visual. I mean, I love art, and I love photography and documentary. I mean, I think it's just such an important source for sharing knowledge, and also for taking apart stereotypes. I mean, I think, when you see an image of a person, it does really help to tear down stereotypes. So I think images can be very important in that way. I think for young children in particular, but also for adults. I mean, we're talking about Mouse, which is a graphic memoir, and the images are so important there. How he represented Jewish people and so on. And so I think, yes, I think images are definitely a way to help people, understand a story in a different way, through different images and symbols. And I definitely feel that with Tia Fortuna's new home, that the images are a way for young people to enter into the story. The symbols are very important. We see the symbols presented in the images, and I think that it's a way to help a person visualize the story. I think visualization is an important form of grasping a story. So yeah, I think the power of the word with the power of the image, and the way those two come together, whether it's in a picture book or in a graphic novel like Mouse, I think they play a very important role. And I think what's happened particularly with graphic novels is so fascinating. I mean, this has been what, in the last 20 or 30 years that they've come to be accepted as literature, and not as a comic book. Not that there's anything wrong with calling it a comic book. And I heard Art Spiegelman talk many, many years ago, and he said, I'm a comic book artist, and he was very proud of that. It wasn't any, he wasn't trying to, to be pretentious about what he was doing in any way. And I think that is really, really fascinating. And so I think, again, like the picture book format isn't just for children. It's, it can really serve the purpose for all of us of really enriching the art of storytelling.
And I just want to flip that and also say it can be a space of real problems. I've been thinking, I was thinking in preparation for tonight about the goblin bankers in the Harry Potter films, especially, even more than in the books. And it doesn't have to, and these things don't have to be, we need to pay just as much attention to the messages being sent by the images, hopefully positively, or at least with impact. I mean, that was my experience of Mouse. I remember I had read Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning, and I was the kid of two historians and apparently a future historian. I really thought that I had the Holocaust as a thing I understood. And I just remember being kind of emotionally wrecked by that, by reading Mouse the first time. And it's obviously the images. But then there is this, I mean, there's still a lot of hook-nosed bankers out there in all kinds of different literature, and it's got to stop.
Mm-hmm.
So I think our final question is coming from Enrique Rosell with the Wilsonian Public Humanities Lab, and I think it's fitting that we end on this note. So Enrique asks, sometimes when we're seeing these attacks against the Jewish community or in literature and against other communities as well, we sometimes feel helpless to these attacks. Do you have any tips for people who want to help combat anti-Semitism or anti-Semitic laws, racism, any of these forms of hate? And or do you have any organizations that you would suggest we look to for support around these things?
Let me just say quickly, and then I'll pass it over. Join your school board and library boards and attend their meetings. Like that's, if that is one of the things that you can really do in a local sense, is you can run, but you can also just go to these open meetings and speak up. And that may be scary. And it may or may not, you can't determine what the impact of your words are going to be in any given context, right? There's so many variables in place and time, but you can determine what you say. And so go to your school board and library board meetings.
I just, in the chat, I just added the name of an organization that I really like, Bechol Lashon, or Global Jews. And I think they're doing very, very important work to combat anti-Semitism and to also share knowledge about the diversity of the Jewish experience and diversity of Jewish cultures.
Amazing. Rachel, do you have any final thoughts?
Well, I just return to I think the point that David made in the very beginning of the panel, which was to not let moments go without without being fully present, without challenging, without speaking up. And that applies to all of us, in our daily lives. And I think that was such an important way to begin, and probably a important note to end on.
Thank you so much. I want to thank all of you, our panelists, for this important and thoughtful discussion. I'd like to thank our co-organizers, Julio Capo and Enrique Rosell of the Wilsonian Public Humanities Lab, and to our co-sponsors, the Holocaust and Genocide Studies program at FIU and the Humanities Edge. Before we close tonight's program, I have a few announcements. So as part of this evening's program, we have randomly selected 15 audience members who will receive a complimentary copy of Ruth Behar's book. And so I want to ask everyone to keep an eye out on your email in the next few days. You'll receive an email from one of us to make sure we can get your mailing address and send you this copy. So you'll hear from us very shortly. And lastly, we have some very exciting programs coming up both at the Jewish Museum and at the Public Humanities Lab. Tomorrow, Friday, March 11th at 1 p.m., please join the Jewish Museum virtually for a conversation on European Jews in the face of the war in Ukraine. It's going to be a fabulous conversation with distinguished Professor Tudor Parfit and Professor Michael Brenner, who will explore the impact of the war in Ukraine on Europe's Jewish community. And I also will drop that link into the chat. I'd like to also hand it over to Enrique Rosell of the Public Humanities Lab, who has a few announcements before we close. Enrique?
Hello. Hi, everyone. Sorry about that. Thank you so much. Before we close, just thank you so much to our speakers for this incredible panel. I feel lucky every day to be able to do this as a part of my job, and it feels really warm to be here today. So thank you all so much for your thoughts and for your pointers, because it does feel, helpless sometimes. So I'm glad that you all were able to point us in the right direction and we can have that conversation. I also want to point out, Luna already pointed out a few of the incredible events happening at the Jewish Museum of Florida, who are one of our community partners here at the Wolfsonian Public Humanities Lab. But I also want to point out another really amazing event that they're having later in the month on March 21st. I Should Have Been a Doctor, it's called I Should Have Been a Doctor, regarding Bob Dylan, a Jewish folk singer, is titled March 21st, 2022 at 7 p.m. Okay, so we've been having a lot of Bob Dylan related programming. So I wanted to put that one out there first. Also, if you're subscribed to our newsletter, you'll be able to see all of this as well. It's on our newsletter. If you go to go.fiu.edu/WPHL newsletter, you'll be able to subscribe to that and get all of this information. Okay, and see the Zoom link for that link as a part of the Jewish Museum's event catalog. And then just on that same note for Bob Dylan, we also have a couple upcoming Bob Dylan events happening on April 2nd, April 8th, and April 9th that are going to be a whole bunch of fun. So keep an eye out for that on our social media and on our newsletter. And last thing that I will mention as well, as a part of the amazing program that Dr. Capo from the Wolfsonian Public Humanities Lab has been working on, we also, last thing I will mention is that we have a Miami Studies workshop that is coming up in April, which I think is also very fitting. I wanted to also ask a question, Ruth, so many questions to ask here, right? But just about, we had an event actually earlier this semester with Gary Monroe, who captured the Jewish community in the 80s in Miami Beach. So many questions that you covered, with the changing landscape of Miami Beach and your own perspective as a Jewish Cuban, immigrant, right? Which I'm sure we'll talk about later. I know we're over time, but I will mention that if you want to learn more about Miami and all of these different discussions that we're having around Miami, come to one of our Miami Studies workshops. This one's happening on April 8th. It's called Building Collaborations and Community-Based Participatory Frameworks, the Black Mothers Care Plan. You can see all of that on our website as well. And we are getting a location ASAP, but wanted to put that on your radar. But once again, thank you so much to Luna. You're absolutely incredible. We love you so much and working with you. And thank you so much again to our panelists for all of your words and thoughts. We really appreciate it.